Hey everyone. So I recently reached 50,000 subscribers and I'm very grateful to all of you for that. I've been asked quite a lot of different questions about my view on different things and what videos I'm going to produce in the future, what topics I'm going to cover. So I thought I'd do the standard YouTuber thing and do a Q&A to celebrate, where I can answer as many of your questions as possible and also let you know what I'm planning on doing over the next year or so. I asked for questions on Twitter, YouTube, Patreon and Reddit, so I've been through all of them and I'm going to try to answer as many of them as I can. Many of them cover the same topics, so even if I don't answer your individual question, hopefully I'll touch on it. There were actually more questions than I expected, so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take the Patreon questions and I'm going to answer those separately in a video for patrons only. So anyway, enough of this messing around, let's get on with it.
Alright, Ben Harrell's asking, what parts of mainstream economics do you like?
There are quite a few different parts of mainstream economics that I like. The one that really stands out for me is matching. So this is very mainstream, very neoclassical. There's a lot of maths. It's about individuals choosing. So for example, matching markets have been used for kidney donors to match people who need a kidney with the people who can provide a kidney. And they've been really, really successful. They've increased the efficiency of organ donation. They've done something similar for placements at schools and for doctors being placed at hospitals. It's a really, really successful research area. So that's the main one that stands out for me. But there's also a lot of individual concepts that I think are really useful. So for example, in my video on trains, I use the idea of natural monopoly. Now that comes from mainstream economics. Where I think mainstream economics goes wrong is that economists will then detail a lot of maths and graphs to try and explore the ins and outs of natural monopoly. And I don't think that adds very much beyond knowing the basic definition and applying it in your interpretation of reality. So there are lots of concepts. There's areas of literature like matching, but I just think that the maths goes too far and mainstream economists also exclude other perspectives.
Jeez, mate, that was all for one answer, eh?
Yeah.
It'll be a long video.
They won't all be that long.
Yeah, I'm just kidding.
Hopefully not.
All right. Headland the Cursed asks, how are you? Doing all right?
Thank you. That's a really nice question to hear. I am doing okay. I just moved house and I'm very happy because I've moved out of a house which was basically a greenhouse, which made me feel very trapped during lockdown. And I've moved to a much bigger house with a garden. So I am very lucky and very happy that I'm feeling a bit better now.
All right. Captain Pink Zero says, have you read the late David Graeber's Debt the First 5,000 Years? And if so, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have read David Graeber's book on debt. It was really sad that he died recently. I really valued a lot of his work and I read Debt when it first came out. It was actually one of the first books which served to radicalize my thinking about economics because it completely contradicted the standard story that economists tell about money as emerging from barter. And actually what happened was that money emerged from modern states as a way of cancelling debts. And Graeber's history on this is really, really interesting. I do think that the book, when it gets to contemporary times, falls apart a little bit. I'm not sure about some of the arguments he makes about the Bank of England, but I think his historical work has been extremely valuable, and it's completely refuted the mainstream notion of debt.
At Rhetoric Better asks, as someone who has listened to quite a few economics podcasts, but still doesn't sufficiently understand economics, how much study would it take to attain a sufficient understanding, and how would I go about doing that?
I think the answer is that if you really want a fully grounded understanding, you're going to have to start reading economics textbooks. I would recommend the core textbook, which is available online and free. It's much better than your standard mainstream economics textbook. It's more empirical, it's more historical, and it's also more pluralist. It has a bigger variety of theories. And, you know, another part of the answer is that it is going to take you time. You know, economics is a complicated subject. It's full of jargon. It's not easy to get your head around everything, and eventually it will click, but it honestly does take years.
Nice answer, buddy. Pandaloo asks, Generally, we use poor economic indicators to track the economy, i.e. S&P 500, GDP, which are somewhat flawed metrics. Do you have metrics that would be better to use for economic health, or is something like greater economic quality unable to be measured?
The economic metrics that we use right now, like GDP and the S&P 500, are definitely not the best metrics we could be using. I made a video about GDP and how flawed it is, for example. But I would caution against the idea that it could just be solved with better metrics. I think ultimately all statistics are abstract in a way, and it's difficult for them to summarize what's really going on for the whole population, whether that's GDP, whether that's a GDP measure that's been adjusted for the environment. So there's the the genuine progress indicator, for example. Whatever it is, it's going to miss certain features of the world. And the fact is that you need to have direct accountability and communication with citizens to know what's going on in their lives, because your statistics are always going to miss something. So better metrics and more metrics, absolutely, but they're never going to be enough.
Felipe Miranda, sounds like a Brazilian name, big up my Brazilian brother. Is there such a thing as bad economics in your view?
Yes, there is. But I think the class of things that I would call bad economics is probably much smaller than the class of things that a mainstream economist would call bad economics. I think mainstream economists have quite a rigid view of economics. But having said that, you do see these things like tweets go around leftist circles, tweets with maybe 10,000 retweets or something that say stuff like, the economy is just made up. And we can kind of do whatever we want. Now, I've just spoke about GDP. The economy is malleable. Of course it is, but that's not the same as completely arbitrary. And sometimes it feels like people forget that production and distribution, they do actually have to take place. It's not a trivial matter to organize a modern complex economy, whether that's according to capitalist or socialist principles. So I think the really bad economics takes are the ones that basically just conclude that economics is unnecessary and meaningless, because it's not. It's vital.
Josh Broderick, big man JB, to what extent should you incorporate different theories and models from different schools into your thought process?
I'm a pluralist, so I would say to the maximum extent possible. I draw from a whole load of different theories in economics. I mean, if you ask me to think about the current rich industrialized countries and what their economies are doing, I would probably go with post-Keynesian economics. I think that's really good at explaining things like secular stagnation and low growth, monopoly, debt levels, and linking them all together. But if you ask me to explain perhaps the growth of poorer countries and how economic development takes place, I would probably go with economic complexity. I think that's had the most success in predicting and explaining growth when it happens. So I think you do have to learn quite a broad range of theories. And I think that there's no set of theories which answers every question in economics satisfactorily.
Ethan says, Hajun Chang says in 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism that understanding the economy is about 95% common sense. What's your take on this?
I'm a massive fan of Hajun Chang. I think he's a great communicator. I think he's very open-minded. I think he sees things with a refreshing perspective. One of the downsides of being a communicator is that you have to simplify. And one of the downsides of simplification is that you sometimes oversimplify. This is an oversimplification. 95% is an extremely high number. I've already said that economics is a complicated subject. I could name quite a few things that are crucial to understanding economics that I don't think come easily. For example, the idea of comparative advantage, the idea that you don't have to be better than others in an absolute sense at producing something. You can just produce what you're best at and then trade with them. The fact that by doing that you actually produce more overall is really, really difficult to grasp. And when you first work out the maths of that trade process, which I have done in a video, by the way, it seems like magic. So that insight is really, really, it takes a while to grasp, and it's way beyond common sense. The Kalecki profits equation, another really good example of something which is really difficult to wrap your head around. And in fact, accounting, macroeconomic accounting in general, the flows of government spending, foreign expenditure, taxes throughout the economy, how they link together, extremely difficult, requires a lot of study. So no, not 95% of economics is common sense. But having said that, more of economics is common sense than mainstream economists would have you believe. That's definitely true.
Lord Retro says, which economic theory / concept do you like the most? The policy that you would like to see applied everywhere? ?
So I'm going to use this opportunity to answer a question that I've seen a lot, but I'm actually not going to display, which is, are you going to talk about land value taxes and Georgism in more depth? And I probably will. I think a land value tax is the best economic idea out there. Again, it's counterintuitive. Most people don't think about land. They don't distinguish land from a house or a building. And the idea that a tax could somehow lower rents and lower house prices, completely counterintuitive, but it does seem to hold, kind of theoretically, but also empirically. So I think that's a really, really great idea. There are very few losers to that policy. I think it would raise a lot of revenue. It would be really good for people in a lot of different ways. And of course, the revenue can be used to fund other things. So yeah, a land value tax for sure. Plus, it's politically not particularly contentious. So Winston Churchill actually tried to introduce one. I think it's one that people on the left and right can get behind.
Peter F. asks, how do we make mainstream media unlearn and give the public a more accurate take on economic policy?
So this is a really good question, and it's a tricky question. I think it's clear that mainstream media aren't particularly interested in unlearning or learning economics in a way that's any different from what's usually taught and economics as it's usually discussed. I think, to be honest, the best way is indirect. It's through providing alternatives. So over the past decade or so, we had the rise of the economics blogosphere, which provided a lot of alternative perspectives on economics. And then you had, people releasing books, people like Ha-Joon Chang, for example, who I just mentioned. And what I've observed really is that as those alternatives appear and people flock to them, you start to see the mainstream media repeat some of those points and engage with some of those arguments. So I think providing alternatives kind of forces the mainstream media to follow that and to engage with those alternatives.
A solid answer, Mr. Unlearning. At Carmel Zakar says, if you could blink Ayn Rand out of existence, would you?
So the thing about someone like Ayn Rand is that, yes, okay, her books are ridiculous and also completely unreadable, but she serves as a very valuable foil. I mean, she's almost a straw man. Her idea that people should just pursue their rational self-interest and that's moral is so ridiculous that it provides quite a good linchpin for people who are criticizing, right-wing or libertarian ideas. And if she disappeared, we wouldn't necessarily have that. I mean, she's very much somebody who said the quiet part loud. She kind of revealed what's at the heart of some of this thinking. So I actually quite like having someone like her there because it makes our job as leftists that much easier. You might say that her ideas have done harm in the real world, which is possible. But to be honest, I think anyone who adheres to Ayn Rand's ideas was already an asshole. They just are using whatever they could get their hands on. If she didn't exist, they'd probably use some other excuse. So on that, I quite like having her around because it's so ridiculous that it's easy to critique.
All right, my favourite Twitter handle so far, at Epic Pokemon Fan, asks, have you read Karl Polanyi and are you interested in anthropology in general?
I am currently reading Karl Polanyi. I've taken too long to go about it, but it's a really, really good book. I can see why it's a classic. I think more generally, the economic anthropological approach of actually going out and observing the world, as anthropologists do, anthropologists will actually go and sit in a village or they'll go to a workplace, they'll go and observe how humans behave. That is the basic groundwork of social science. It's what you need to do. You need to know what is going on. And it's something that economists almost never do. Probably partly because it requires interacting with real people. But I don't know enough about it. I only really know David Graeber was mentioned before. I know Polanyi. I could probably, at a stretch, name a couple of other economic anthropologists, but I really would like to do more on it. And, in the long term, as an academic, I would actually like to engage in that kind of research and go out and interview people, because I think it's not done enough, it's not valued enough, and it is absolutely crucial.
Fred Hampton Stan account. Will efficient computers solve the productivity problem of planned economies?
Yeah, so let me use this question as an opportunity to answer more generally about the problems with planned economies. So I don't think planned economies work. And while I don't necessarily agree with the right-wing narrative about the Cold War and the Soviet Union, because I think it's very biased and too triumphalist, it's a fact that the Soviet Union wasn't really able to provide for its citizens. Yes, it was able to industrialize intensively. Yes, it was able to engage in World War II with a planned economy. But when it came to the kind of everyday business of people producing and consuming in line with their needs and their local situation, it just wasn't able to do this. And in this sense, the right-wing critique of central planning is absolutely right. Now, how does this relate to things like increasing use of computers, increasing use of data and big data? Well, again, I don't think that these things are necessarily going to solve the problem, because I think the problem is a little bit deeper than just not having enough data. Data don't speak for themselves. They always require interpretation. There's always a question of what data you gather, what metrics are you using? Somebody has to make those choices. And in a planned economy, whoever makes those choices has a lot of political power. And that gives you authority that isn't necessarily legitimate. And it also leads to biases in the decision making, which don't account for local circumstances. And so I think that ultimately, the anarchist critique of the state and of central planning is absolutely correct. On a fundamental level, more statistics and more computational power aren't going to solve that problem. You need people to be producing and consuming, organizing from the ground up.
Is Not So Good asks, what's the point of unlearning economics?
Yeah, this is a really good question. My YouTube channel, as you can probably see, is pretty new. I only have 7, 8 videos. Most YouTube channels have a little introductory video when you first go on their page. I want to do one. It will probably be something along the lines of what is unlearning economics, where I just chat about what it means. So what does it mean? Well, it's not actually that strong a statement in some senses. You might think of it as, completely forgetting about economics and not using economics at all. That's not what it means. What it means is that the economics profession as exists and economic discourse in public debate as it exists is extremely rigid. And not only is it quite rigid in its ways of thinking, I find that economists really, really struggle, even if they want to break out of old habits of thinking, to break out of the standard ways of thinking. And this is what I spotted in myself, as well as in others, when I was doing my economics education, when I was doing my degree. And it's why I started a blog back then when I was an undergraduate, because I just wanted to learn to escape the old habits of thinking. And that process means that, to go back to earlier, it doesn't mean that I'm rejecting mainstream economics altogether. What it means is that I am able to think outside mainstream economics and using other methods. But that might sound quite simple. Actually, when you've been through a standard economics education, it's really hard, because that way of thinking exerts quite a grip on your mind.
All right, we've got another Brazilian here, Gustavo Romero, asks, I'm burned out with my economics bachelor's, even though my university is fairly plural and heterodox. What kept you interested and invested? Things always seem so dismal.
Well, I think there's two aspects to this question. One is what happens when you're an undergraduate generally, whether you're studying economics or physics or English literature, you will tend to get a bit tired of your course approximately halfway through, which is where I'm guessing you are. I think that the honest answer is that you just have to tough it out. And, once you can see the end, once you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, it will pick up again. I think things will also start to click. I definitely, during my second year, got very tired and very bored of what I was learning. But, by my third year, I was much more engaged with it. And it does get more interesting as you go on, I think. With regards to economics specifically and how to deal with that, well, you say you're learning at a heterodox university, or you said fairly heterodox, I think. That doesn't necessarily mean there's no mainstream economics. In my experience, even the more heterodox universities teach quite a lot of mainstream economics. I would encourage you to think of economic models in particular as kind of mathematical puzzles, kind of like a very advanced Sudoku that you just solve, and, you have to do it for the exams, and you don't necessarily engage with it in the sense that you think it represents the world. That's what I learned how to do. And I think that can kind of save you from the mental burden of trying to relate it to the real world, because in many cases it just doesn't. So yeah, that would be my advice.
Cosma, if left alone, would businesses slowly aggregate into larger entities, or would smaller, more local businesses be fine in such an environment? If yes, is this bad? If it's bad, what should we do? Sorry if it's a big question. Thanks, dude.
So I tend to go on this question with the approach of economic complexity theorists like Alan Kerman, who talk about how the distribution of firms tends towards a kind of power structure. So what that means in plain language is that there are some very big firms, but there are also lots of little firms. I don't think that you would ever reach a stage where, for example, one firm controlled everything. I think that there will always be small firms. But having said that, there has been a tendency towards monopoly observed in the richer countries, especially over the past few decades. And I do think that these companies exert too much control, especially the companies like Amazon. They have too much control over most markets, most goods markets. They can squeeze out small suppliers. They have too much control over labor markets, for example. They impose very harsh conditions on their workers. And the tech companies have a lot of control over data, and they have a lot of control over what we see and our attention, and that can change, how we think as well. So monopolies are definitely too big, or at least too powerful, and something needs to be done about it. But I don't think that we would ever reach a situation where there were just a handful of companies and that's it. I think there will always be smaller companies as well, because they often serve different needs. Like a local cafe, for example, serves a very different need to somewhere like Amazon, and that's not going to go away.
All right, on a more serious note, No Justice is asking if you like Marmite.
So I have quite a well-developed opinion on this, which is that the advertising slogan has always been you either love it or you hate it. And I know most advertising is generally bullshit, but I just think this is really, really wrong. I think Marmite is just okay. I have it sometimes. I'm happy to have it on toast, but I don't love it. I don't seek it out. I think it's all right. And I know a lot of people who also just think it's all right. So yeah, the love it or hate it thing is bullshit.
But also genius.
But also, yeah,
As
exactly.
we're still talking about it, 20 years later?
Yeah, exactly.
Sam Levy, where are you on MMT?
So modern monetary theory, along with land value taxes, this is something that I probably get asked about most often. Not to turn this into too much of an advert itself, but I did do a full video on this for patrons if you'd like to listen to me talk about it for 15 to 20 minutes in depth. MMT, there's a few reasons I don't talk about it that much publicly. Number one is that on a lot of the substantive issues, policy issues, I do agree with MMTers. We should expand spending on a variety of public services, on maybe universal basic income, maybe job guarantee. And, we should also raise taxes on rich people and perhaps raise taxes generally. I think most MMTers tend to agree with that. So my differences with them are mostly academic. I don't think they're necessarily important for crucial questions such as who gets stimulus during a pandemic. When people are, really suffering, I don't want to get involved in those debates. Having said that, there are a couple of things I will say. Number one is that the online presence of MMT I find to be very toxic. I don't talk about it partly because if you do critique MMT, you will get piled on by people on Twitter. And a lot of its adherents can exhibit some very unpleasant behavior. They're not the only ones on Twitter by any means. They're not the only economics school on Twitter that does this by any means. But I don't think it's very good behavior, and I think it really needs to stop. Substantively, some of their arguments I find kind of strange. So, for example, they will argue that we don't need taxes to finance spending. But then if you say, well, what, so you just reduce taxes to zero then? They'll say, well, no, you need taxes to control inflation. So you don't use taxes to finance spending, but you spend what you want. And then when inflation increases, you use taxes. This is just, we're going around in circles here. Do you want to raise taxes or not? Yes, it's really, really simple. That whole debate strikes me as completely fruitless. Taxes are needed because they displace resources from one activity to another. That's their use. I don't know why much more needs to be said than that. And MMT can really obscure that whole debate.
Max Hauser, how and when did your descent into heterodox economics begin? All details, please.
So this is a kind of personal history. This is one that I've got quite a lot as well. So I started to study economics in 2007. At high school, at A-level, when I was 16. And the reason I studied economics was actually quite personal. It was because it combined qualitative and quantitative approaches. And there aren't many subjects that do this. Usually, if you're going to go into maths, you're going to go into science, you're going quantitative. If you're going into history, you're going into literature, you're going qualitative. I find those words actually quite hard to say.
Yeah, take us.
If you're going into maths, you're going into science, you're going numbers, quantitative.
Come on, buddy.
No, my tongue is gone. Okay. If you're going into maths or science, you're going to do quantitative stuff. If you're going into history or literature, you're going to do qualitative stuff. Economics is one of the few subjects that combines the two, and I really liked that idea. And I wasn't disappointed with my A-levels as well. I wrote a lot of essays, but we also used some maths and we also used statistics and accounting. So I did find it really interesting. As I was studying, though, the 2008 financial crisis happened, which was immediately reflected in the classroom, which is, commendable from my teachers. It's good that they started to incorporate it straight away, but not so much during high school, but after high school. All of the books critiquing economics as a cause of the 2008 crisis, or bad economic thinking as a cause of the 2008 crisis, they started to appear, and I started to read them, and I realized that what I'd learned was a very narrow part of economics, and there was much more to it. So I took a couple of years out between high school and university. In that time, I read a lot of these books. I got a more critical perspective. I took that into my degree, even though my degree was quite mainstream, and I continued to read outside the degree. So from undergraduate onwards, I've always been quite heterodox and quite critical of the mainstream. But to sum up, that happened because of the 2008 financial crisis. That is the reason.
At Skyborg asks, in your rail video, you mentioned that buses may be a more important focus and that you hadn't looked into it. Did you end up looking into it? And if you have, do you have an opinion on them? I'm assuming it's not enough to warrant a video.
Yeah, so I feel a little bit bad about this because when I said it, it was kind of an off-the-cuff remark. You're right that the likelihood of me doing a video on the economics of buses, certainly in the short term, is pretty low. The likelihood of me doing another video on transport in general, which mentions buses, over the long term is probably quite high though. But for now, I did look into the issue. Partly some suggestions from commenters helped, and I listened to a really interesting podcast about buses in the UK, which I can put in the sources. So hopefully that will satiate your need for some economics of buses.
Nice, bro. The Serfs are asking, who are some leftist economists you like or trust? Most people usually say Richard Wolff or Robert Hanel. Hanel? But I'd be really interested to hear your list. Oh, also, congrats! !
Thank you. So, so Richard Wolff, a lot of people have asked me about Richard Wolff. I'm less familiar with the work of Hanel, so let me just answer the question about Richard Wolff. Now, I have to say, to be frank, I'm not that enamored by the way he approaches his critique of capitalism or by the way he approaches his alternative of worker co-ops. Now, I say that as somebody who agrees with both of those things. Sometimes his critiques of capitalism, for a professor of economics, it's kind of strange to me that they sound like something that's been lifted from Fight Club, like, oh, advertising's got us working jobs we hate to buy shit we don't need. And it's like, okay, I expect somebody, in the street to say that, but not an economics professor. I think there's a bit more to it than that. And so he can be quite glib, I think. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier with, communication. Maybe his target audience just isn't the same as what I would consider my target audience. And maybe it's really good that he simplifies. And he is a good communicator and he is a good debater. And he's, I like watching him talk, but sometimes it doesn't feel like there's that much depth there. I mean, I read his book on worker co-ops and I'm convinced of them despite his book. I didn't get very much from it. So that's my opinion on Richard Wolff. As for good economists, some recommendations. So Ha-Joon Chang has been mentioned. His book, Economics, A User's Guide, I think is a really, really good introduction to economics. 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, also very good. And there's economists like Mariana Mazzucato, who talks a lot about the role of the state in creating innovations, in creating technologies and growth. I really rate her work as well. Kate Raworth and her donut economics has kind of re-embedded the economy back into the ecosystem, which is an absolutely vital lesson. I think someone like Dean Baker is really good. He's really critical of existing capitalism. He talks a lot about things like intellectual property and how they funnel wealth up, how that funnels wealth upwards to the rich. And Jonathan Aldred, another Cambridge economist, along with Chang, who has some really interesting critiques of the profession. And one final one who's who has a big presence online is a guy called Josh Mason, who I know personally, full disclosure, but I used one of his articles quite a lot in my most recent video. Honestly, Josh's work is a rare example of very academically rigorous, but also quite easy to read. So I would recommend finding his blog and just, he's not got a book or anything, at least not yet, but anything he's written, and he's kind of broadly Marxist, but without the rubbish bits. So I would really recommend Josh's work.
At Hong3227 asks you the most overrated economist and the most underrated economist.
So I'm going to answer those in reverse order. The most underrated economist is, I think, Elinor Ostrom. Her work on how communities manage the commons and manage, communally held resources is absolutely crucial, A, for anybody who wants to understand economics, but B, for leftists who are thinking about how you would build communism, as in actual communities coming together and managing their economies. I think it's absolutely crucial. Now, she did win the Nobel Prize in economics, so for me to call her underrated might sound a little bit strange, but despite winning the Nobel Prize in economics, I don't think most economists know very much about her work. I mean, she takes basically an anthropological approach, and she went and actually studied communities in person, face to face, and she learned how they worked. That kind of work isn't valued in economics. Despite the Nobel Prize, I think you could go through a PhD in economics without really knowing who Ostrom was. So I think she's underrated. As for overrated, well, there's staunch competition, but I really think it has to be Larry Summers. The man is a complete wanker, and I don't understand how he still has so much credibility. He is still listened to. Any time he says something, everybody rallies around him. Oh my God, Larry Summers has come up with this great idea. He, talked about secular stagnation. Secular stagnation is the idea that we've entered permanently high debt levels with permanently low growth levels. And then it suddenly became the centerpin of economic debate. And that idea has been around for such a long time, decades, almost a century. And yet it took him to say it for it to actually become a central part of the debate. And I don't understand, because he was instrumental in repealing some of the regulations which led to the financial crisis. And every time he intervenes, he reduced the size of the Obama stimulus. And now, recently, he's tried to make reduce the size of the Biden stimulus as well, or make it only targeted at certain people. Every time he intervenes in real economic debates and real economic policy in which he has a lot of power, he does it in a conservative direction, and yet he still paints himself as a progressive. And, interpersonally, he's not very nice and he's sexist and all the rest of it. I don't understand how he has any followers or any fans. I just think he should be completely expunged from public debate.
Joe Earl is asking you, what historical economist do you think you're most similar to, and why?
Okay, so I don't know if there's any way to answer this without sounding kind of self-important, because obviously all the historical economists that people know were very successful. The truth is probably that I'm like one that nobody remembers. But let me answer it by saying, what kind of historical economist would I like to think I'm like? And the answer to that is clear: Joan Robinson. So she was very active in the 50s and 60s at Cambridge. She knew John Maynard Keynes, although she outlived him substantially. She was one of the first post-Keynesians, which is the school that I subscribe to. But the reason I like her is not even because of all of that and all of her contributions. Her writing style and her critiques of economic theory were so concise and acerbic that I aspire to emulate that style. I mean, it took her about a paragraph to just completely body the quantity theory of money. And so many pages of ink have been spilled over that. Her paper, Shedding Darkness, is 2 pages long. Honestly, it has the best critique of the quantity theory of money that you'll find. So I would hope that, I could achieve half of her level of concision and humour, wit in her writing.
All right, we've got a big question coming from Bad Mouse. Why not communism?
Okay, so this is again a question I've had quite a lot. Now, I have answered the question of what do I think is wrong with a planned economy. So I'm going to answer the question of why not communism, as in its original conception, localized communities which organize resources. Now, the first part to my answer is to say I absolutely advocate those things. I just mentioned Eleanor Ostrom. I think that's crucial. I like the work of Murray Bookchin in, bringing technologies into local communities and having them respond to the needs of the community. Having said that, I don't think communists of this type or anarchists truly engage with the level of organization, as in the size of organizations required, and the economies of scale that brings. I don't think they engage with how necessary those are for us to live in anything resembling a modern society. So I do think that anarchists and communists are right that large organizations are inherently illegitimate. They have an authority and a power that can never be truly justified, even if they're internally democratic, which they should be. But I do see those large organizations as a necessary evil. I don't understand how a bunch of small communities which coordinate somehow through some kind of political federation would be able to produce the kind of complex goods and services that a modern industrialized society needs. I also don't see how, without something resembling a state, you could have, for example, universal provision of basic services, universal basic income. I think you can do it to varying degrees in some cases, You can have localized gardens, allotments, local food production, to give you an example, but I don't think that's ever going to replace the modern complex economy entirely. So yes, communism of that type, where possible, but I don't think it's always possible.
Chris is asking what your real name is. I want to read your papers and your dissertation.
Okay, so I'm going to be honest with you. If you really want to find out who I am, then you probably can. With enough Googling. I would request that you don't. There's a reason I'm pseudonymous, and that's because I think that a lot of what I say on my account, including my YouTube videos, could negatively impact my career as an economist, because typically I don't think, dissenting voices are really sought after or heard within the mainstream. At some point, I will probably, reveal who I am. I don't think it's that much of a big deal, though. And as for my research, obviously, I can't show that to you either, but I will tell you that it's quite mainstream research. It's very focused on economic models and on statistics. I think it's, valuable as work can be within that framework. If I had my way, I'd probably be doing something a little bit different. And that's what I'm going to seek to do for my career. But to be honest, my PhD and the research I've done so far doesn't really relate to anything you'll see on this channel. So it's just completely different.
Sean's saying, I assume you're going to get a bunch of econ questions. So creatively, how do you motivate yourself to write scripts? Have you always been into making things, or is it pure will born from lefty econ ignorance?
I think that the truth is that it's something that comes quite naturally to me. I think I honestly have always had a hard time staying out of debates, and I always stick my oar in. And the same goes for economics, Twitter, YouTube in general. So even if I have not been writing regularly or producing videos regularly, I will tend to think of arguments and ideas and think about things in my spare time. It will just happen, and I will tend to come up with things that I could write even in periods where I'm taking a break. So that aspect of things is just something that I think I tend to do, whether I'm actually putting it into action or not. So it's just a matter of, getting those thoughts onto a script and making them coherent. As to the more direct question of, when you're struggling creatively, when you're halfway through a script and you don't know how to get out, you don't know how to finish it, you don't know if it makes sense, you don't know if any of the jokes are funny, you don't know, anything, you're just kind of really confused. My answer is that I take a break. I think that's always the best thing to do, drag yourself away from it, drag yourself away from the computer. And that break can be, 1 minute to go to the bathroom or something, or it can be 1 hour where you go for a walk, or it can be a day where you don't touch the script. That's fine. But I think you do have to take breaks. And I always find that ideas coalesce in my head when I take a break. I can't think of a time I've taken a break and I haven't had a brainwave. So I would really recommend that. Don't work yourself into the ground. Just step away from the computer.
Tommy Hoare asks, if there was one economics paper that you could go back in time and somehow prevent being published or read by anyone else, what would it be? A corollary? What the fuck is that word?
Corollary.
A corollary of this would be one paper that you wish every economist had read.
So the one that I would like to eliminate, without question, Milton Friedman, The Methodology of Positive Economics. It was actually a book chapter, but it's shared widely as if it's a paper. So I think that it counts. Honestly, this paper is incoherent. It argues that basically economic models can make whatever unrealistic assumptions they like. And he says that as long as the theories make good predictions, it doesn't matter how unrealistic the assumptions are. He even says that better theories will have more unrealistic assumptions. This is just nonsense, Sure, assumptions can be a necessary evil to get us to a good scientific theory. It's not the case that the atom is truly a little solar system with the protons and the neutrons at the center and the electrons orbiting like planets. when we get down to that level, as far as I understand it, things are actually quite blurry. The model of the atom we have is just that. It's a model. However, the idea that investigating that assumption is completely wrong or invalid is incorrect. Obviously, physicists, scientists are concerned with how systems actually work. They will always investigate assumptions. Friedman used this to argue against early evidence that firms, when you ask them, have no idea what mainstream economic models of pricing are. They don't understand them because they don't cohere with their understanding of how they price at all. Friedman dismissed that evidence. You can't dismiss that kind of evidence. That's not good science. And finally, I will say, Friedman argues for economic theory as instrumental for making predictions, but he doesn't even provide any good predictions that economic theory makes. Not one in that paper. So, yeah, okay, I might listen to his argument a bit more if he actually had some predictions, but he doesn't. So it's the only methodology paper most economists read. It is the standard refrain of the discipline when you question assumptions. It's completely wrong. It's poisoned the discourse on economic methodology. And with regards to a paper I wish every economist had read, I'm blanking a bit. I think I don't really have one favorite paper. I would suggest a bit of a strange one, which is actually the priority heuristic, written by Gerd Gigerenzer and his co-authors. Is a really interesting paper because it's a theory of individual decision making that completely departs from the standard neoclassical theory, and it's extremely successful in its predictions, but also very realistic in its assumptions. So I just mentioned Friedman. I think this paper proves that you can make good predictions outside standard mainstream economics, and also that those better predictions often come hand in hand with more realistic assumptions. So I would recommend reading that paper.
Ahmad Kathrada 13, who is just a random guy, asks what your views are on technological utopianism and strong AI.
So this is a question that I get quite a lot as well. And I left it in because I actually want to say I don't really know the answer to this. I don't know that much about AI. I think it's always good to have things that you just don't really have an opinion on. AI doesn't interest me that much. If I had to say, I'd say I think that the idea of Terminator-style AI is still a fantasy. We do have very powerful machines and algorithms that are affecting our lives already. And if robots start to do all the jobs, then the problem will be one of distribution. If some people own all the robots, then that's the problem. It's not the robots that are the problem. So you need to redistribute or reconfigure ownership claims or whatever to make sure that everybody can enjoy that technological advancement. But beyond that, my knowledge of AI is really limited. And I just want to take this opportunity to say, if your question isn't in here, I've tried to answer most of them, either directly or, through answering another one. It's probably because it's something like this where I just don't really know that much about it.
Mr. Lawhole asks if you game.
Yeah, this one's come up a lot. And the answer is that yes, I do game. When I was a kid, I used to play mostly Nintendo, so I'm a big fan of Nintendo still. I've got Zelda, and I play the Mario games. I had an N64, a GameCube, a Wii. I didn't get a Wii U. Around that time, I realised that, I was about 18, 20, I realised that I should probably be doing other things than gaming, but I have gone back to it recently, and I've got a Nintendo Switch. I also used to play World of Warcraft, and I recently started that again. I started World of Warcraft Classic, which is like the old version, so it's more in line with what I used to play. I play a Shadow Priest in case you know anything about WoW. And the sub question to this one, which I've seen a lot, is are you going to stream yourself playing games? Now, quite possibly. I'm quite bad at multitasking. I don't know if I have anything interesting to say while I was streaming. Except kind of, exclamations and swearing or whatever. But we can give it a go and see if it works. Maybe WoW. One game that I sort of had to catch up on because I took my break from gaming was Dark Souls recently, which I really loved. I thought it was absolutely incredible. So maybe I'll get Dark Souls 2 or 3 or Bloodborne or something up on the computer, and you can all watch me fail miserably at that.
Can you also give Mario Kart a shout out?
We play a lot of Mario Kart in our household as well. So I just want to say, I think on my Switch, that's the game with the most hours. I think we're nearing about 300 hours on that now.
Oh, yeah, actually?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
and who do you play as?
Who do I play as? Either Dry Bones or Koopa Trooper. They're interchangeable, really, on the Flame Rider with golden wheels to augment the speed. I'm really good. I'm really good at Mario Kart.
You are very good, and sometimes King Boo.
And sometimes King Boo if I'm feeling, a little bit wild.
And scary.
And scary.
Alright, moving on. Amatri is asking, in your latest videos, you talk about how most economists basically know nothing about the other soft sciences. Which of the sciences are you currently learning about to better evaluate certain aspects of the economy?
Excellent question. So, in my opinion, economic sociology is one of the better ways to understand the actual economy. There's quite a few economic sociologists that I like. The main one is arguably the founder of economic sociology, Mark Granovetter. He wrote a paper called The Strength of Weak Ties on networks and how they govern things like labour markets. And I think that is a really underappreciated fact in mainstream economics, because markets just kind of operate, and there's something called the axiom of completeness, which means that essentially, all aspects of the system are somehow taken into account. Networks tells you that, who gets a job? Well, it's the person who knows the employer or knows someone who knows the employer, 9 times out of 10. And that brings, social dimensions into the analysis as well. So network analysis and economic sociology, I think, are super important. I wish economists engaged with them more.
Okay, Iron Poot on YouTube asks, the right often likes to frame itself as the fiscally responsible, more pragmatic types. For the American right wing, you can just point at their defence budget to demonstrate the falsehood of that claim. For European right-wing parties, though, it's less obvious. Do you think there is some truth to the claim that they are more financially responsible?
This is a really interesting question. This was the most upvoted question on YouTube as well, by the way. So thank you for this. My bottom line here is that being fiscally responsible isn't actually a good thing, certainly not in all circumstances. I think budget deficits are a necessity to essentially keep the economy at full employment and usually to provide for people's needs. Having said that, the idea of fiscal responsibility obviously holds a lot of political weight, so we need to engage with that. Is it true that right-wing parties, perhaps outside the US, are more fiscally responsible? Now, let me take my country of the UK. It's true that since 2010, for example, the Conservatives have engaged in a lot of spending cuts. But is that the same as being fiscally responsible? Well, not really, because they've missed their deficit target. Originally, they said they'd eliminate the deficit by 2015, but they didn't. They completely missed that. They were just about reaching it before the pandemic hit. It's not clear to me that making spending cuts actually reduces public debt, because ultimately public spending can be good for people, can be good for the economy. And when you cut it, you create a vicious cycle, you create poverty traps, and that's no good for the economy, the budget, or the people. So it's true that they do engage in more spending cuts, but at the same time, they also cut taxes, and it's not clear that spending cuts are good for the deficit anyway. So overall, I would say it's generally a myth. And I think if you do look at the stats, certainly for the UK, generally right-wing parties, or the Conservatives, I should say, have run bigger deficits overall.
That's really interesting. I understood that one.
That's good.
Robert Smith asks, who is your favourite breadtuber or leftist spokesperson? Is there anyone else you like to watch on YouTube that's not related to politics/economics? For fun.
Well, I'm going to be boring with the first part of the answer and say it's ContraPoints. Especially after you've written a script, you realise quite how incisive her scripts are. When she says something, it's worth saying, and there's no fluff in it. She does the big spectacle before she actually gets to talking, which I find entertaining, but what she says is absolutely on point. and it's, jargon free and it grips you. I don't think there's a better left YouTuber than ContraPoints. Do I watch other videos? Yes, I watch loads of stupid videos on YouTube. Actually, I recently deleted it from my phone because I was watching too many. One that I would recommend is a guy called Mr. Andrew Cotter, who was Sky Sports commentator. In lockdown, he obviously was very bored and started to commentate on his dogs and what they were doing. As I describe it, I realise I'm kind of killing the joke, so I won't say too much more other than just watch it. It's really, really funny. Olive and Mabel, they're called.
Nice. Max Res Default says, now that BreadTube v Economics is over, do you plan to keep making leftist content, switch to purely economics content, or continue making a mix of the two?
So the answer is I plan to continue making a mix of the two. I mean, a lot of people have asked about future videos, so I'll just use this as an opportunity to tell you what I'm going to do over the next year or so. I've got a couple of collaborations planned, actually. There's one on economics and how it's used in public debates like the minimum wage, like rent control, and how standard economics has really been shown to be false empirically by modern work. And that's with Mexi. I've also got one on new optimism and Steven Pinker, the everything's getting better narrative. I want to critique that, and that's with Sam from We're in Hell. So that's going to be part of a kind of ongoing series where I critique statistics as used by classical liberals, let's call them. So maybe Jordan Peterson and gender, Sam Harris and race. And I want to do a lot on alternatives to capitalism, and I want to do things on the economics profession as well. I did one on Black Lives Matter in the economics profession. I want to talk more about some of the problems it has. So there's a lot of ideas that I have.
Dylan says, do you think a more democratic workplace-based economy is more likely to occur naturally through more co-ops and some such being set up by small business owners, or due to government intervention and regulation?
It's a really great question, and I've been asked a lot about worker co-ops. I will say that I do plan to do a very in-depth video on worker ownership and why it's justified in the relatively near future. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to, discuss why I like worker co-ops. I think with large-scale production and organisation, the authority of bosses and managers is inherently illegitimate. At the workplace, you get told what to do. And that is not by somebody that you have elected. It's not by somebody who is really accountable to you. And it doesn't even matter how rich you are. Obviously, the more money you have, the more choice you have. But ultimately, everybody gets told what to do by their boss. And that kind of hierarchy I see as completely unjustified. So I think that ultimately authority always needs to be accountable. And there's a lot of benefits of worker co-ops. So, for example, they have been shown to be better for employees' well-being. Why is that? Well, people who have control over their own lives and who have a stake in what they're doing are generally happier. They're also more productive. It's like if a teacher told you to read a book, then you'd be like, this book's rubbish. But then if you went home and you read it in your own time, you might be like, oh, this book's great. It's just better for people to have control over their own lives. And I also think that, the same critique as applies to central planning of states applies to corporations. Bosses don't know what's going on in their organizations. Have you ever seen the show The Undercover Boss? The bosses go and they pretend to be a worker. They interact with workers. They don't know even what hours the workers work. They don't know how much they get paid, let alone the actual details of what's going on. And the bottom line is that for these organizations to work, people actually have to kind of take control of their own work, and they have to break the rules. I mean, there's a really good example of something called the work to rule strike, where employees go on strike by following the rules that they've been given meticulously. And of course, production grinds to a halt because they can't work their way around all of the individual idiosyncrasies of what's going on in their particular factory, for example. And the thing is, this type of work is discouraged under capitalism, and it's also not rewarded. And I think, more participatory structures, more democratic structures would reward and encourage this type of work. So worker democracy is absolutely vital. To answer your question about is it going to happen just from people starting co-ops, I don't think so. The corporate form has to be changed to be a democratic one. Currently, it favors shareholders. That's not granted from God. That is a legal, it's a legal structure that can be changed. And it wasn't true, 50, 60 years ago. It doesn't have to be true now. We can make corporations democratic, and that has to happen because there's no way that family or local co-ops can truly compete with the big corporations.
Stefan Kotz, do you agree with the labour theory of value? If not, what is the underlying mechanism that drives prices under capitalism?
The labour theory of value. Economic value is another idea that I want to write a video on. I don't find the labour theory of value satisfactory. I don't actually really find any theory of value satisfactory. I'm happy to have a debate about what we value, what society values, what should be produced. Absolutely. The attempt to turn that quite qualitative and amorphous concept into a scientific theory, I think, has always failed. The labour theory of value, it doesn't really explain prices in the sense that it doesn't predict them. Neither does the subjective theory of value. I don't think either of them explain prices. And to be honest, I don't even think prices are that big of a deal. Both mainstream and Marxist economics place too much of a role on prices. Most organisation in modern economies takes place within corporations and within the state. And even between corporations, it may not involve prices. So I don't think the theories of value have been successful in their quest to predict and explain prices. And I don't really think it's something that needs to be done. I mean, the way I would explain prices is through a historical analysis, so taking each instance on a case-by-case basis.
LW says, where is good to study for heterodox/leftist economics in the UK or abroad?
So in the UK, you've got the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in London. You've got Greenwich in London, Kingston, Goldsmiths, both in London. You've got University of West England in Bristol. You've got Leeds University. And you've got the Open University, which is obviously virtual, which is a good place to study right now. That's pretty much it for pluralist heterodox departments. And I'm sorry if I've missed one or two off, but there certainly aren't many more. In the US, you've got University, Missouri, Kansas City. You've got the University of Utah. You've got the New School. You've got the Levy Institute, and you've got the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. I think in Europe, generally, you're going to do a little bit better in your standard economics degree for a bit more pluralism, a bit of a broader perspective. I'm not sure about any specifically pluralist universities in Europe, though.
D503 asks if you read novels. What are your favourites?
I do read novels. I fairly recently introduced a rule that my bedtime and spare time reading will only be fiction because I read too much non-fiction in general. So it's nice to read something a bit different. At the moment, I'm reading Girl, Woman, Other, which has a really interesting writing style. The prose is broken up in a way that no other book is, which is jarring at first, but it actually becomes quite intuitive as you read more and more. So that's a good book. My favourite book is probably The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. It's about anarchist society and its competition with a capitalist society. It's really well written. Cider House Rules, another very beautifully written book by John Irving. And I also really like Philip Pullman, his Dark Materials, and I've enjoyed the recent additions he's made to that series.
Solid books, mate. Now, Go Home asks, what football team you support?
I'm a Liverpool fan. So obviously things went very well for us last season. This season, we've lost Virgil van Dijk for probably another 6 months, to be honest. Our defence is looking a bit shaky without him. We're looking not as good as we did last season in general, but I am confident that things will get better. I will admit freely to being a bit of a plastic fan, so, I don't actually watch that many games. All things considered, a football game is about 2 hours long, which is actually quite a lot of time, and I don't always necessarily want to spend that time watching football. I also get quite anxious watching Liverpool, so overall it's not necessarily something that I do all the time, but I am emotionally invested and I do care how they do. So hopefully, we'll finish the season better than we've started it at least.
Cool. Up the seagulls. Grover Blackware asks, do you think economists fulfill a religious capacity in secular societies?
This is a really interesting question. I mean, there's a few different ways to answer this. I think one way that economists are accused of being a priesthood is a kind of caricature, as in, they have no evidence behind anything they say, and they uphold free market neoliberal ideology, and politicians do what they say. That's a kind of caricature that you see out there. I don't think that's very true. But if you think about religion as something which helps us to understand the world, for better or for worse, and which shapes the world and shapes institutions, and which occupies a central place in political debate, which economics and the economy does. I mean, the way the media worry about the economy does have something of a religious fervour to it. So in that way, I think economics does have a kind of religious function, yes.
Anthropocon asks if you think a universal basic income could ever work.
So this is something that, again, I will make a video about universal provision of income and also of services. It depends what you mean by work. Is it technically feasible, affordable? Yes. Are there experiments which show that it has produces positive outcomes for people? Yes. Guy Standing talks about this, for example. It's good for people's mental health. It's good for, them making ends meet. Also, it does things like allows women to escape from abusive relationships. I think that's all really positive. Now, there's the other aspect of possible, which is politically possible. Universal basic income, I think, kind of undermines one of the key features of capitalism, which is that you are essentially dependent on work for survival, whether survival is interpreted as, literal subsistence or as a kind of socially necessary standard of living. So in that sense, would it be allowed? Or would it, even if implemented, be whittled away at? Because ultimately it undermined the labour market and the idea of wage labour. I don't know. I don't think we're likely to see it really as truly universal on any scale under capitalism. If we're talking about moving away from capitalism, then I do advocate it, and I do think it's completely feasible. So that's it for the questions from Twitter, YouTube, and Reddit. There were some really interesting questions there, guys. Thank you. And there were quite a lot of questions which came up over and over again and had come up even before I did this Q&A. So I'm happy I got a chance to give you an answer to those, even if it's relatively brief, before I get a chance to do, a full video on them. So I'm going to do some more questions for my patrons, as I said at the beginning. And the next video on basic economics is going to drop in a few weeks. So I guess I'll see you again at 100k.
Jeez. Tell them to like and subscribe.
Oh, like and subscribe,
Yeah,
please.
baby.